And first, again, thank you for joining us for our Blue Carbon in Practice webinar. I'd like to first introduce you to our speakers today. My name is Stephanie Simpson, and I'll be moderating today. I'm the Blue Carbon Program Coordinator for Restore America's Estuaries, and today I'm pleased to have two expert speakers with us from TerraCarbon to talk about what it takes to develop a blue carbon offset project. First of all, TerraCarbon is a leading advisory firm that develops and implements market-based solutions for habitat conservation and restoration. Our speakers include Scott Settlemyer. He's the co-founder and managing director of TerraCarbon. Scott works with landowners and managers to raise money for restoration and conservation through the development and sale of carbon offsets. Since it was started in 2006, TerraCarbon has helped 27 conservation projects around the world that are protecting nearly 5 million acres. Scott is a finance expert and the former CFO of the Chicago Climate Exchange. And we also have with us Jamie Eaton, who is the senior manager at TerraCarbon and works with TerraCarbon's clients to assess carbon project feasibility, design carbon accounting, and monitor carbon results for forest and wetland restoration and conservation projects. He is an expert in forest and soil carbon measurement and has supported projects and research across the globe. Jamie holds an MS in environmental science from the University of Virginia and a BA in biology from St. Louis University. I'm very grateful to have Scott and Jamie as guest speakers today, but before I hand it over to them, I just want to let you know a little bit about who we are at Restore America's Estuaries, if you're not familiar with us. We are a national nonprofit dedicated to the protection and restoration of our nation's bays and estuaries as essential resources, and we also lead an alliance of 10 conservation organizations across the coast of the U.S. We're located just outside of Washington, D.C., where we provide a united voice for coastal conservation in the nation's capital and advance the science and practice of protecting and restoring estuaries through on-the-ground projects, groundbreaking science, high-level meetings, and the power of convening people. One of the programs that we do this through that we coordinate nationally is our Blue Carbon program. We are fortunate to have the support of many partners, and I would definitely be remiss if I didn't take a second to thank them. This particular series for our Blue Carbon webinar series, we have partnered with the Gulf member organizations, the Gulf National Estuarine Research Reserve, Fish and Wildlife Coastal Program, and EPA Gulf of Mexico program, as well as the National Estuarine Research Reserve Science Collaborative, to conduct a series of workshops in the Gulf. And the topic for this webinar has come as a result from these Gulf workshops, as attendees have requested additional information on the process of developing a carbon offset project for tidal wetlands. So also, if you're interested, we have a couple of upcoming workshops in the Gulf, one in Tampa, in Baton Rouge, and in Puerto Rico. If you're in these areas and interested, you can send me an email to receive registration information once it's available. So that's kind of the premise of this webinar, how it's come up. This Blue Carbon in Practice webinar series. We hope to continue to provide blue carbon information on how you can apply blue carbon ecosystem services to help meet your restoration and conservation needs over the course of this next year and beyond. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and hand the reins over to Scott and Jamie. So Scott, I'm going to pass the control over to you. Scott, you're live whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. And thank you to Ray for organizing this webinar and inviting us to present to you today. For us, blue carbon projects are some of the most interesting and promising projects in the carbon markets today because they have the potential to help us both mitigate and adapt to climate change. As far as the agenda today, I'm going to start by giving you some background on blue carbon and what it is, and then I'm going to hand it over to Jamie, who is going to talk about the voluntary carbon market, give you a better idea of the demand for blue carbon credits, He's also going to cover some basics around carbon project development and the process there. And he's going to share a case study from the forestry sector and try to draw some lessons learned from that we can apply to blue carbon. And then I'm going to take it back and talk to you a bit more about challenges for blue carbon projects and hopefully share some insights for those of you who are considering the development of a blue carbon project yourself. I'm going to skip this slide. Stephanie, thanks for the intro on Terra Carbon. I'm just going to jump into what is blue carbon. So what do we mean by blue carbon? Well, it refers to the carbon and other greenhouse gases that are removed or that are emitted by coastal ecosystems, such as seagrasses, mangroves, and salt marshes. These coastal ecosystems provide a number of benefits that are well known to a lot of people, including storm protection, filtering of coastal waters, as well as serving as nursery ground for fish. One of the other benefits, though, of these systems is that they remove large quantities of carbon dioxide from the air, and they're capable of storing that carbon in their plants and, most importantly, in their soils, and are capable of accumulating 1 to 2 tons of carbon per hectare every year. And in terms of overall carbon storage, these coastal ecosystems match or can even exceed the carbon storage that we see in tropical forest ecosystems. One of the main differences, though, as you can see, is that most of this carbon is stored in the soils of these ecosystems and less so in the biomass, which will become more relevant to our discussion around developing these projects as carbon projects. So why is it important? Well, despite the many benefits of these ecosystems, we're losing them globally at a high rate, somewhere between 1% and 7% each year. In the US, we've lost major portions of our coastal ecosystems along the east and west coast, as well as along the southern Gulf Coast, due to agricultural and urban development pressures. What makes blue carbon exciting, though, is that it provides another potential funding tool for the conservation and restoration of these areas, and potentially, provides another incentive for managers to restore these systems. There are generally 3 types of activities, project activities that can generate greenhouse gas benefits in coastal ecosystems. The first 2, restoration and creation of tidal wetlands. There are now approved methodologies that can be used to account for the greenhouse gas benefits of those activities, and we'll talk about some of those resources a little bit later. There's also some ongoing work right now to expand those methodologies to also cover the greenhouse gas benefits of conserving or avoiding loss of existing tidal wetlands. In our experience so far here in the United States, I'd say we're having the greatest number of discussions around restoration, and typically in situations that involve restoring tidal flows to these systems where they've been disconnected from the natural tide and are degrading and through that process of degrading are releasing carbon back into the atmosphere instead of removing and storing carbon. I'm going to hand it over to Jamie now to talk about voluntary carbon markets and carbon project development.
All right, thank you, Scott. So my name is Jamie Eaton. I'm also working with Terra Carbon. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a review of the voluntary carbon market. I think some people are familiar with the role forest carbon projects can play globally, but we're going to kind of focus today primarily on the voluntary market. So in 2014, which was the last year, as some figures were available, about 400 million was transacted on the voluntary carbon market. And notably, half of these are from the forestry and land use sector, and throughout those, a little bit more than half is transacted on the verified carbon standard. If you look at the kind of the pie graph below, pretty much all the area to the right is going to be the forestry and land use sector. I'm not sure if you can see my pointer, but right at the 180 degrees there's this other forestry sector in the outer circle. And that's really where we're hoping to see some growth in wetlands and some growth in blue carbon. Try to see that expand and play a larger role within that forestry sector. So move on a little bit to really who are the buyers, both by sector type, experience, motivation. I like to include this slide from the ecosystem marketplace, really because we have so many different parties coming to this webinar for different reasons, and usually we get some questions from surrounding these issues. So the buying sector, a little bit more than a quarter is really the carbon market, so people buying to sell, resell. A little bit less than a quarter is the energy sector, and then there's an additional about 10 to 15% in the finance, insurance, as well as events and entertainment to offset some of their emissions. In terms of who's buying, about 90% are buying multiple years or come back to buy every year. And then the buying type, about 90% is the end user. I like to go down, kind of look at the buyer motivation tab. I think that's very interesting. On the left, you have a little bit more than a third that are companies that are pursuing kind of corporate social responsibility goals, and another third that are really pursuing kind of a climate-driven mission. So I think that's very telling in terms of who is financing and who is supporting these projects and supporting really forest carbon offsets in general. So kind of getting into some of the nitty-gritty of project development, we've kind of dumbed this down to really focus on the high levels or the high-level design of a kind of a generic forest carbon project or a generic carbon project. So first we start with the project design phase. So initially within this phase you have the feasibility analysis. So this is really to get a feel for what the project activities are, such as planting trees or trying to restore tidal flow, what the emission reductions are likely to be, what some research in a similar area has shown, potential emission reductions will likely be throughout the course of your project. And then, if your feasibility analysis looks favorable, a lot of times a project will move forward into the project design document. So this is the primary document of a carbon project, and within this document is really demonstrating that a project meets both the requirements of the standard as well as the requirements of the methodology. So here's where all the nitty-gritty kind of takes place, a lot of the carbon accounting, and most of the work in terms of starting and documenting the carbon project. Then you go into a validation phase, which is essentially an audit of the project design document. External auditor really just checks your project design document against the requirements of the standard and the methodology. Then you go into the registration phase. So at this point, you have a project that's registered, and your project may have started, prior to registration or kind of at the end of completing your project design document. Your project may start then. It's important to note here is this is kind of where you start your project generating kind of greenhouse gas emission reductions from the project start date. So going into the project implementation phase, so this is, you do some activities such as planting trees or restoring tidal flow that can achieve greenhouse gas emission reductions. Then you monitor this over some time period, maybe 2 to 5 years. And then you have another audit. This is a verification audit, which is really to check two things. One is that you followed your project design, but two, that the credits that you are claiming, the carbon credits that you are claiming have actually taken place. And I think it's this double kind of audit, one in the project design and two in the kind of the audit of the monitoring that really leads to the robustness in the voluntary market. And it's only after this second audit has taken place that you're actually issued credits. So I'm going to go into a case study, and yes, this is a forestry case study. Unfortunately, most of the kind of blue carbon work that we've done so far is really kind of in the initial stages. Our case study, it's a very kind of simplistic carbon project because it's very evident what your emission reductions are. So it's really planting trees in the lower Mississippi Valley. So you've taken this agricultural field at the bottom, you're putting trees in it, and as the trees grow, they sequester carbon. So, the baseline is essentially 0, and your credit of carbon is pretty much all the biomass that is accumulated in the trees. This is a larger kind of reforestation initiative. So about 77,000 acres in the lower Mississippi Valley since 1999. And then TerraCarbon has been associated with registering 34,000 of these acres in 4 different VCS projects and 1 ACR project. So why was the project done? Some of this was hinted at in the previous slides, but really carbon sequestration, climate change mitigation, some of the financiers were forward-looking, and they realized that kind of in coming down the road that they may have to either offset or account for some of their emissions from their companies. There was also a desire both at the level of the funder as well as the level of the landholder to restore habitat and really reconnect some heavily fragmented forest landscapes. These projects are also beneficial for protecting soil resources, improving water quality, and providing for natural flood storage. So where was this work done? 77,000 acres. This is a fairly large kind of reforestation effort. So most of it's in the lower Mississippi Valley, Arkansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee within the United States. And most of the land is either U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service land or kind of a state conservation organization. I really like this picture. It's a screen grab from a Google Earth that really shows, this is the full 77,000 acres, but it shows the scale of the effort as well as the location and proximity to the Mississippi River there. Kind of going further into the details of who was part of this. Really, the project was set up as a public-private partnership between the project developer and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Wildlife Refuge. So the public-private partnership was really led oftentimes by an NGO, which restored lands with private funding, and then the landowner such as U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, really allowed that private entity to keep their the carbon credits. I like this next slide because it really shows all the organizations that were part of this effort. So the NGOs that kind of help lead the work and pull all the parties together, like the Trust for Public Lands, the Nature Conservancy, and the Conservation Fund. And then some of the landowners that we worked with, Kentucky Division of Forestry, Arkansas Game and Fish, Forest Service, Texas Parks and Wildlife, Mississippi Wildlife Fisheries, and Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation. And I took the time to name everybody because I think there's a really important point in that to achieve this large-scale restoration, there's a lot of entities involved, both on the NGO side, well, often on the NGO side, and then often on the landholder or land manager side. So some of the lessons, carbon projects can serve as a basis for the public-private partnership. I think that was pretty clear in our case study, and I think this will continue to be true, kind of in the case of blue carbon. Scale is important to lower project development and monitoring costs. Obviously, we operated kind of this 77,000 acres over several states, which can be logistically challenging, but on the flip side, we had enough acreage to offset some of the kind of fixed cost. And then restoration takes time. So this started in 1999, and really I think the last plantings were in 2009, 2010. But it took a long time to scale this up and to put everything in place. All right, I think I'm going to hand this back over to Scott if I can figure out how to do that. All right, Scott, I think it's back to you.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. Okay, so thanks for that. And what I wanted to talk about is a little bit more about, as we look at blue carbon and sort of learning from the forest carbon sector, what are some of the challenges that we see to developing blue carbon projects. And the first one that we wanted to highlight was in measuring the greenhouse gas fluxes, and that in blue carbon projects we see this is more complex than we see in forest systems. One of the reasons it's more complex is we have more greenhouse gases we have to be concerned about. In forests, we're primarily concerned with carbon dioxide, but in coastal wetlands, we also need to think about methane and nitrous oxide emissions, which are also greenhouse gases and are often present, especially in integrated systems. Another part of that is that these gases are highly variable across sites and across locations, and can vary based on a number of factors, from things like soil temperature, the amount of sunlight, the amount of salinity in the water will all have an effect on these gases. And measuring them on a regular basis can be expensive. It involves a pretty significant field effort, often involves some field equipment that can be expensive. And so for blue carbon projects, this sort of measurement of the greenhouse gas fluxes can be a complex and costly exercise. And I'm going to talk in a few minutes about some of the ideas for addressing that. A second challenge that we see for blue carbon projects is around land ownerships. In our experience so far, it's just more likely that coastal ecosystems are going to involve public lands, and they're also going to probably involve private lands when you're working at restoration at sort of a landscape level. So, there's going to be a number of people impacted, and while it may be clear who owns the land and who would therefore own the carbon rights, it's not always clear, especially in the cases of public agencies, if or how they can transfer those rights to a private sector partner as part of a blue carbon project. Jamie gave a good example of how that was done in the forestry sector. I think the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service really at the sort of leading edge of that, and as well as were some of the state, forestry and game commissions. But certainly, it's still a new area for these agencies, and requires a lot of discussion. The sort of last challenge that I'd like to highlight for blue carbon projects is the issue of scale. As Jamie mentioned, in the case of the case study, we had more than 70,000 acres that were restored with carbon financing, and for many of the blue carbon projects that we see today, that's much bigger than what we typically see. And at the moment, for example, one of the restoration projects that we're looking at, a tidal wetland restoration, is about 1,000 acres. I think that's considered a pretty good-sized project in coastal restoration, and it's still we're still looking at whether or not it's large enough to generate enough emission reductions to justify the cost of the carbon project. A lot of those costs are fixed. They're largely fixed, and they don't, whether your project is 100 acres or 1,000 acres or 10,000 acres, the project development costs and the project monitoring costs don't vary a whole lot. So what to do about these issues? We can't claim to have all the answers at this point, but we did want to give you a few ideas to consider. As far as the first issue of measuring greenhouse gas fluxes, it seems to us that academic institutions can be great partners with blue carbon projects. They have the resources and expertise to actually install and manage the equipment to measure these gases, and they also often have access to grant funding to help pay for it. And if the work is designed properly, the results could serve as a basis for default values that could be used by other projects, similar projects occurring in the same region, and could significantly reduce the cost of measurement. I think that's a great idea. I think the reality is today some of those first projects are just starting. So we don't yet have a lot of those sort of default values available for use, but there's certainly some promising initiatives in certain regions of the country where that's starting. As far as land ownership, I mentioned before, it's important to do a lot of outreach work with the landowners and other stakeholders who might not be landowners, but people involved in the community that are affected. by these projects, and to educate them about blue carbon and what some of the opportunities are, what some of the considerations are, and to really highlight the benefits of restoration, and that that carbon is really just a tool to finance that restoration, but it could be used to sort of in exchange for those public benefits. And I think that becomes, if you look at some of the public agencies who've done carbon projects to date, I think that's how they've become comfortable that they're achieving, a restoration or a conservation goal with private funding. And if that means, assigning the carbon rights to get that funding and to accomplish that goal, they're happy to do that. And then finally, on the issue of scale, I wanted to highlight a mechanism within the voluntary carbon standards that has been used in the forestry sector, and that could be very useful in blue carbon projects. And it's a mechanism that's referred to as grouping. So grouping projects is to take similar projects and to aggregate them, combine them into a single project registration. Obviously, that helps to reduce the cost, is because instead of doing several project registrations, you do one, and those costs are shared among all the grouped projects that participate in that project. The other obvious way to deal with scale, and I mentioned this before, is to look at opportunities to use default values for greenhouse gas measurements to reduce the level of field work that's necessary. Obviously, the more you can use that, lower the cost of the project. The smaller projects become then more feasible as carbon financed projects. And then finally, Jamie talked about feasibility analysis, and it's not a self-serving slide. It's really our best advice for people who are looking at developing any type of carbon project, including blue carbon projects. And that's to take a closer look at these various elements of the project to consider whether it would likely be successful as a carbon project, whether it would generate enough revenues to justify the costs, so that you don't sort of invest in the design of a project and then are later surprised by those things. So this sort of work early on is not only helps make better decisions, but it also helps a lot in managing expectations of all the project partners and stakeholders. And then finally, I'd like to highlight some of the resources that are available to you if you're considering the development of a blue carbon project. You'll see the website address at the bottom of the slide. On the RAE website, you can find links to the methodology that has been approved under the Verified Carbon Standard for tidal wetland and seagrass restoration. You'll also find a really helpful practice guide, Coastal Blue Carbon in Practice, which helps you, it should probably be read alongside the methodology. It's a less technical document. It provides a lot of good examples and other resources to help you in applying the methodology. And there are some additional resources as well that you'll find on the RAE website, and I encourage you to take a look at that if you're considering one of these projects. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Stephanie in case there's any questions.
All right, thank you so much, Scott and Jamie. I'm just going to put up some contact information for folks. And a reminder that since this webinar is being recorded, we'll be able to post it online and share that with your colleagues, with other interested folks who weren't able to make the webinar today. And as Scott mentioned, we have several resources, including those mentioned today on this webinar and more, available on our website at estuaries.org/bluecarbon. There's also a monthly Blue Carbon Buzz e-newsletter that we send out. That, like I said, that's once a month, and that's on blue carbon related events, publications, and more. And you can sign up for that on our website as well. So we'll take a look at some of the questions that were coming in through this webinar. First, question from Carol: how many blue carbon offset projects are registered, and where are they located? And I believe, as Scott and Jamie were saying before, we don't have any blue carbon projects that are being implemented at that stage in the game. I don't know, Scott and Jamie, if you have anything to add, or if there is somewhere where people can look and see what other projects are registered.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. This is Jamie. Thanks, Carol, for the question. So, really the first blue carbon methodology really just got, I think, up and running in the middle of last year. That's a couple-year development process to get that methodology in place. So now that the methodology is in place, and prior to the methodology, it was getting blue carbon accepted into the standard. So it's kind of been a long process to get here. I think there's a few people moving forward on blue carbon projects. Having said that, it's unclear which of these projects will be registered as a carbon project under the verified carbon standard. So it's possible that you will do a project and that you could have some net GHG benefit and just not go through the extra steps to validate and verify the project, and then kind of go all the way to issuing credits. So, like Stephanie said, there's none currently. There's a few that we know of, at least, that are in the I guess in the feasibility phase. They're both in the Northeast U.S. On the coast.
And I would add, because I think technically, and to recognize that there has been some work done in mangrove, developing mangrove restoration projects within sort of the forestry methodologies that were already available in the voluntary carbon market. So I think, like, for instance, there's a project I think off the coast of Senegal that involves mangrove restoration that was utilizing the forest methodologies, and really, a lot of the benefits that are being quantified there are in the biomass of those trees. And as Jamie mentioned, in coastal ecosystems, a lot of that carbon that's stored is in the soil, and we the methodologies for that have just kind of come online to do better accounting of that. So if you're interested in mangrove restoration with sort of a focus on biomass, you can find a couple of projects out there. One is in Senegal. I believe it's registered with the VCS, but hopefully we'll have some others in the coming several months to be able to speak more about.
Great, thanks. Our next question is from Isabel, and she asked, do the presenters consider inland freshwater wetlands as blue carbon?
Well, this is a good question. I think it's I'm not bothered at all when people refer to inland freshwater projects as blue carbon. I mean, I think probably just as far as in practice, when people use the term, they're mainly referring to coastal ecosystems, but certainly, inland wetlands is an area that's also, received a lot of interest. It's not the methodology that we referred to earlier at the end of this webinar that was developed by Restore America Estuaries and its partners only does apply to tidal wetlands and to seagrasses. There may still be a lack of methodologies for some of the freshwater systems, although we are seeing some development of those as well occurring.
Scott forgot to give us a little plug. We've also kind of are in the early draft stages. We have a complete draft of a methodology for precocins, which are peatlands, temperate peatlands along the eastern seaboard in the U.S. That's an ACR methodology, but that's kind of in the early review stages. And then in terms of other freshwater wetlands, I think there's been some efforts to look at methodologies and develop methodologies, but one is the greenhouse gas dynamics are often very specific to location due to soil type, due to climate. So I think there's definitely opportunities for that, but we haven't seen kind of a very large, expansive kind of inland wetland methodology. I will mention kind of two other wetland methodologies. One is a Mississippi coastal deltaic wetland methodology that's up and running under ACR, and then I think there's either a variation of that methodology or a similar methodology that's for California, and I think some of those are coastal and some of it may apply to some more inland wetlands. I'm not sure of the details on that.
Great, thanks guys. We have another question from the Ketchimek Bay National Estuary Research Reserve. They're interested in protecting salt marshes since there's not as much of a restoration opportunity there. So their question is, could protecting salt marshes provide a potential blue carbon bank for buyers? And I can potentially also provide an answer for this as well, is that yes, avoiding the loss of that stored carbon that's in the soil of these ecosystems does have a potential to generate carbon offsets. Right now, Restore America's Estuaries and our partners are working on the development of a conservation methodology for tidal wetlands. It's in the draft stages right now, but that is exactly the goal for that type of methodology, is to allow conservation projects to also be eligible to generate carbon offsets. And I don't know, Scott and Jamie, if you have anything else to add.
I do not.
No, I don't either. That's a good answer.
We have a couple questions for the case study that you mentioned. Let's see, one from Barbara is asking, in the process of planting that 7,000 plus acres of trees and doing the follow-up monitoring, were the landowners awarded credits? So when in that process were those landowners awarded credits, or how long did it take from conception to the award of those credits?
Sure. Yeah, so kind of the way the projects were structured is the landowners, in most cases, did not get the credits. It's the person that planted the trees. So I think the typical structure was that there was a kind of a conservation NGO working with the financier, one of the financiers in one of our ACR project was Entergy, and Entergy funded pretty much, in some cases, the acquisition of land, and in some cases, the acquisition and planting of land. And in return, Entergy essentially was awarded the carbon credits generated from the growth of that forest. So yes, these, I think we mentioned 5 projects. I think 2 or 3 have already claimed credits. Usually you monitor every 5 years, and after the monitoring, which is essentially a forest inventory, so you pretty much go out and measure how much carbon is there, it is at that point that you can claim credits. So kind of the challenge with afforestation projects are the initial years of forest growth. First you have stand establishment, and then you have growth, and that can be slow to start accumulating. It's really when the forest reaches probably ages 15 to 20 or 15 to 30, probably 15 to 30, that they really start packing on the biomass, and so you have kind of a higher rate of carbon accumulation. So yes, they have been issued credits, and I think you know they will continue to get credits every 5 years if they go through the monitoring and verification event.
And let me just add, with blue carbon projects, it may be, the frequency of monitoring may be different. It's going to be based on, sort of cost benefit of monitoring and how expensive it is to monitor versus how many emission reductions you expect to generate during that monitoring period. But you could imagine it will be more frequent than 5 years, depending on the size of the project, but it wouldn't be surprising to see, every couple of years in a lot of cases.
Great, thanks guys. Next question from Norman. How different funding sources for blue carbon will be accessed or sourced for these projects?
Well, I can try to answer the question if I understand it right. The question is around how do you access these sort of blue carbon funding, I'd say from looking at other projects in the carbon market, conservation, forest conservation projects. There's sort of two stages when that has happened. The first is like prior to project implementation, where a carbon offset partner is identified and supports the development of the project and wants to be involved at an early stage and provide some upfront funding to help make that occur. I do want to stress that in all cases we wouldn't expect that carbon funding would be sufficient. It would just be one sort of layer of a much bigger funding strategy. So if you're fortunate, and I think it's if you can, getting that funding up front is the best idea. In other cases, carbon offset partners are more risk averse, don't want to take on the risk of sort of involved with registering a project, and would rather see the credits actually get issued before they provide the funding. In which case, it could take a few years before that funding actually kicks in. So obviously that's less desirable than getting it up front, but for many buyers, they have sort of constraints on sort of the risks that they can take there. So it could come either before the project is implemented or after it's monitored for the first time.
Great. Thanks, Scott. And I'll just add to that is, that's a huge area of potential for blue carbon is to bring additional investors to the table, I think, at the onset of projects. Investors that maybe would not normally invest in these types of coastal conservation or restoration projects, that are interested in not just the local values that these projects provide, but also the global climate values that these projects provide. And then, for those kind of farther down the stream funding sources as credits are being generated, we see that as a great potential to help fund typically underfunded project components. So the long-term, monitoring and management of restoration and conservation. So I think there's a lot of potential, and going forward, it'd be interesting to see how some of these projects work out. We have another question here. It's Elizabeth asked, do we have a list of organizations or groups who are available as consultants to do feasibility analysis? I think that's a great idea, first of all, to have that, and that's something that Restore America's Estuaries can work on. But of course, shameless plug over to our experts on the phone, Terra Carbon. They do just that type of work and are working on a couple of the first blue carbon feasibility studies as we speak. So I don't know, Scott and Jamie, if you'd like to add anything else.
No, I mean, thanks for the mention, and yeah, of course we'd love to speak with anyone who's interested to just talk about what it might take to develop a project. It's usually it's typically a process that takes time and curating. So I'd say start early if you're thinking about it. Start talking to partners, experts, and if you can, try to jump into sort of feasibility as soon as you can to get more details and have a better discussion with those partners.
Okay, thanks. We have another question. Let's see about Scott. You had mentioned the minimal size of a project to make a viable, from a cost-benefit perspective, viable carbon project. Is it possible to kind of give a little bit more detail about what a good estimate of what a good project size might be?
I hesitate a little bit to give a specific number, but as far as the framework, the sort of two variables that are going to drive that answer are how many emission reductions are going to be generated by the project. So if you have a system that's currently degrading very quickly and emitting high levels of greenhouse gases, and you can sort of stop that degradation and stop those emissions, you'll get higher number of credits. And the flip side of that is what are the costs, and that's driven partly by how what's the availability of things like default values. Are we going to have to do field measurements? And I think those two together, you can figure out, am I going to generate enough emission reductions and enough value from the sale of those that exceed the cost of developing and monitoring the project. So I think I hope that we'll have some better ranges to give people as we get through some of these feasibility studies. I think it's just too hard to say right now, but generally I think anything under 1,000 acres I think will be hard, but I just think every situation is going to be different, so it's just best to look at it case by case at this point.
I think that's probably when the option for grouping projects will come into play a little bit more. Am I right, Scott?
Yeah, no, thanks for that reminder, Stephanie, because that's one way to deal with small project size to get other projects of similar nature in the same region to pull together into a single project, and help spread those costs over greater area. So I do think even if you have a small project, if you feel like there's other people like you that could do the same thing and would be interested, it's still worth considering and seeing if you can get a grouped project together.
Right. So we've got a couple more questions. We'll try to get to in the next 4 minutes of this webinar. Helen asked, she has a couple of different questions actually about more details about actually development and monitoring and what the different registration costs might be for these types of projects, and then how far off is this from being an easier thing to do with the default values, methodologies, and case studies. And I know, Scott, as you both said before about estimating what isn't a good size, I imagine estimating costs can kind of be a difficult thing to do. But I will go ahead and say, as far as methodologies and default values, the science around blue carbon has grown significantly in the past 6 years and continues to grow as more and more studies finding default values in different regions. More data is becoming available. It is still a need, so I would encourage academics and others interested in doing research that this is a great area to have your research really have applicability. is to find out what are the different carbon storage and sequestration values of different habitats regionally. But Scott, maybe if you want to talk more about some of the different examples of development, monitoring, and registration costs.
Go ahead, Jamie.
Well, I was going to say, on monitoring costs, you can't really say much. It could be essentially, just the effort of using kind of a default value and making your calculations, to quite extensive costs if there were no values for your ecosystem, and you had to put something to monitor greenhouse gas fluxes in place. So I don't think there's a good answer for monitoring. It's site specific, unfortunately. I think project registration costs are going to be fixed. Scott probably has some idea of what that may be.
Yeah, I guess I would say, I would give you a couple of reference points. I'd say for, like developing a forest carbon project, because, those have been done a lot by now. And, Jamie mentioned there's sort of, the sort of main costs are developing the project design, which is taking the methodology that's approved and documenting how you're going to account for all the carbon benefits. That's essentially the project design. That goes through a third-party validation process as well, a third-party audit process. So the cost of preparing that and getting it audited, sort of at the very low end for a forest project can be, $60,000 to $70,000, but it easily could be, depending on the type of project, could be double that. And I think, for blue carbon projects, they're going to be more complicated than the simplest forestry project. And we talked about some of the complexity in measuring the gases, and so I do think it's going to be closer to that sort of three figures. But hopefully, there's going to be other potentially other resources that can be leveraged, maybe some other ongoing research. Maybe it gets funded in a different way. Maybe it's already being funded that can be used, as part of the carbon project to help manage those costs a bit. So I know that's a squishy answer, but hope that gives you a little reference.
Thank you, guys. And there's a couple questions coming in about the use of standards and auditors. I'd like to reference you to some other webinars that we have posted from previous webinars about carbon market setup and how carbon offset cells purchases are regulated, how their kind of the quality control is established through the use of standards for that. I'm going to take one more question just came in under the wire, and I think it's a really interesting one, and that is, have you coordinated with the ACR protocol under development for California wetlands, and how will that be different? And I think that's a great question. I'm not entirely sure, and I just wanted to check in with Scott and Jamie and see if you have any information on that.
Well, I could say real quickly that at least as far as the Air Resources Board, which is the regulatory agency in California that sets the standards for offset projects. I mean, they're currently, don't include coastal wetlands in their offset protocol. There has been some interest in coastal wetlands for a while that preceded even the development of the compliance standards, and I think at the time, some of the groups there thought that there was still more science that needed to be done in coastal wetlands, and really, I think pilot projects need to get developed that can demonstrate that we can quantify the greenhouse gas benefits of tidal wetlands, and I think when we have that, I think the opportunity to go back to California and to the regulatory agency to lobby to be included in that system get a lot better. So, my guess is it's not going to be in the next couple of years, but if we can get some projects in place, it would be nice to have a discussion in say 2020 when the sort of next phase of that program will start up.
Okay, great, thank you, Scott. Apologies for you if we weren't able to address your question. We're a little bit past time right now, so if you still have that question you really need answered, or just interested or have additional questions that come up, please feel free to email us. This recording will be posted online, and I'll send a link out to everyone with that. And again, more information on our website at estuaries.org/bluecarbon. So that is all the time we have for today. A reminder to please fill out the survey questions when prompted after leaving the webinar. And thank you very much, Scott and Jamie, for being our guest experts today. And thank you all for joining us.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.